A single photograph. Two identical faces. And a family secret buried deep beneath years of silence. Sometimes, the truth doesn't set you free, it shatters everything you thought you knew. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey. The front door burst open with such force that it banged against the wall. A backpack thudded onto the wooden floor, and a breathless voice called out, "Mom, you won't believe what happened today." Elijah Parker, an energetic 10-year-old with tousled brown hair and bright hazel eyes, stood in the doorway, his cheeks flushed from running all the way home. His mother, Margaret Parker, looked up from the dining table where she was sorting through a pile of unopened bills and school notices. "Elijah, slow down," Margaret said with a tired but warm smile. "What's got you so worked up?" Elijah practically bounced in place as he kicked off his sneakers, leaving them haphazardly in the entryway. "There's this boy at school, Mom. His name's Lucas. And he looks exactly like me." Margaret's brow furrowed slightly as she leaned forward, placing the stack of papers aside. "Exactly like you?" "Yes. Same face. Same hair. Same eyes, everything." Elijah's hands gestured wildly as if trying to shape the words in the air. "Even the way he smiles. Mom, it's like looking in a mirror." Margaret chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetheart. Sometimes people just look alike. It happens more often than you think. You've probably just found your doppelganger." But Elijah wasn't having it. He crossed his arms, a deep frown etching itself into his usually carefree face. "No, Mom. It's not just a resemblance, it's exact. Like we could be twins." Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker. Barely noticeable, but Elijah caught it. She recovered quickly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Elijah, that's very unlikely. Besides, if you had a twin brother, don't you think your dad and I would have told you by now?" Elijah hesitated, the excitement in his eyes dimming slightly. "Yeah, I guess. But it's just so weird. Mom, you have to meet him, you'll see what I mean." Margaret stood and walked over, gently placing her hands on her son's shoulders. "Sweetheart, why don't you wash up and get ready for dinner? You can tell your dad all about Lucas when he gets home. Okay?" Elijah sighed and nodded reluctantly before trudging upstairs. Margaret remained in the hallway for a moment longer, staring at the spot where her son had been standing. Her smile faded completely now, and a shadow of unease crossed her face. Later that evening, the faint aroma of roasted chicken and buttered vegetables filled the Parker household. The family dining table, a worn wooden piece passed down from Margaret's grandmother, was set with mismatched plates and water glasses. Elijah sat at his usual spot, his head propped up by his hand as he poked at a pile of mashed potatoes with his fork. The sound of the front door closing signaled the arrival of Elijah's father, David Parker, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and tired eyes. He walked into the dining room and placed a quick kiss on Margaret's cheek before ruffling Elijah's hair. "Hey, kiddo. How was school today?" David asked as he settled into his chair. Elijah perked up immediately. "Dad, you're not gonna believe this. There's this kid at school named Lucas, and he looks exactly like me. I mean exactly. Same face. Same everything. What if we're twins?" "Dad?" David froze mid-motion, his fork halfway to his mouth. The lively chatter of dinner ceased instantly, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the kitchen wall. "Margaret, sitting across from David, noticed the sudden stiffness in her husband's posture and the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the fork tighter. "Elijah," David said, his voice unnaturally steady. "That's impossible. You don't have a twin brother." End of discussion. The sharpness in his tone made Elijah flinch slightly. Margaret shot her husband a warning glance. "David," she said softly, her voice laced with caution. But David avoided her gaze, focusing instead on his plate as he resumed eating in silence. Elijah's excitement had vanished entirely. He sat quietly, pushing his food around the plate, stealing occasional glances at his father. Margaret forced herself to smile and break the silence with casual small talk. But the mood had shifted irreparably. That night, after Elijah had gone to bed, Margaret found David in his study. The small room was filled with shelves of books, dusty trophies from his college baseball days, and stacks of old paperwork. "David," Margaret said as she closed the door behind her. "What happened at dinner? Why did you react like that when Elijah mentioned Lucas?" David was seated at his desk, his head bowed as he rubbed his temples. He didn't answer immediately. "David, look at me," Margaret pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you know something about this?" Finally, David lifted his head, and Margaret was startled by the tired, haunted look in his eyes. "It's nothing, Margaret. Just let it go. Elijah's just a kid. Kids imagine things. But this isn't just imagination. David, you froze tonight. You couldn't even look at him when he asked about it." David shook his head and stood abruptly, walking over to the window. He stared out into the dark night, his back turned to her. "Margaret, please, just drop it." Margaret stood still for a long moment, studying her husband's rigid posture. Her stomach churned with unease, but she knew she wouldn't get more out of him tonight. Without another word, she turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Upstairs, Elijah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across his face. His mind raced with thoughts of Lucas, his mirror image, and the way his dad had reacted at dinner. "What if Lucas really is my brother?" he thought. Downstairs, Margaret sat on the edge of the couch, clutching the class photo Elijah had brought home weeks ago. Her thumb traced over her son's face, and then she paused as her eyes landed on Lucas, standing just a few rows away. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was chilling. The house was quiet, but the weight of unspoken secrets pressed heavily on every corner of the Parker home. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows of the past, a truth waited to be uncovered. The scent of grilled cheese and tomato soup wafted through the Parker kitchen as Margaret stirred the pot with slow, deliberate movements. The sun was setting outside the window, casting a warm orange glow across the countertops. But the light felt distant, almost hollow. Her mind kept replaying last night's dinner over and over again, David's sharp reaction, Elijah's crestfallen face, and the cold silence that had followed. David hadn't spoken much since then. He had left early for work that morning, barely acknowledging her as he grabbed his travel mug and disappeared out the front door. Now, as the clock ticked closer to 6, Margaret felt her stomach twist with unease. Elijah sat at the dining table, scribbling something in his notebook. His tongue poked out slightly in concentration. And for a moment, Margaret smiled softly at the sight. But the smile faded when she caught herself comparing his face to Lucas's in the school photo. The door creaked open, and David stepped inside, loosening his tie and setting his briefcase down by the entryway. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he paused before stepping into the kitchen. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Dinner's almost ready." Margaret replied without turning around. Elijah looked up and beamed. "Hey, Dad. Guess what? Lucas sat next to me during art class today." David froze in the doorway for half a second before forcing a smile. "That's great, buddy." Margaret's hand tightened around the wooden spoon as she caught David's reflection in the glass cabinet door. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Dinner was quiet. Each bite of food scraping against mismatched plates, the only sound filling the room. Elijah, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air, chattered away about school. About Lucas. About how their teacher mixed them up twice that day. David barely spoke, occasionally nodding or offering a faint chuckle. But his eyes remained locked on his plate. Margaret couldn't take it anymore. "David," she said softly, but firmly, "can we talk after dinner? Alone?" David's fork paused midair. He glanced up at her briefly, his face unreadable. "Sure." Elijah's eyes flicked between them. "Are you guys okay?" Margaret forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Eat your soup." But Elijah wasn't convinced. His gaze lingered on his parents for a moment longer before he went back to his food. Later that evening, after Elijah was tucked into bed and the house had settled into an uneasy silence, Margaret found David in his study. He was sitting in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in one hand and his phone in the other. The amber liquid caught the faint glow of the desk lamp. "David," Margaret began, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk." David set his glass down with a soft clink. "I know." Margaret stepped forward, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "What happened last night? Why did you react like that when Elijah mentioned Lucas? And don't you dare tell me it's nothing. Because I know you." "David." You froze. You couldn't even look at him. David exhaled, a deep, ragged breath as he rubbed his forehead with his palm. "Margaret, some things are better left in the past." "No," Margaret said sharply, her voice breaking slightly. "Not this time. You owe me the truth. You owe Elijah the truth." David stared at her for a long moment, his expression caught between fear and guilt. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "Then tell me. Because right now, it feels like you're hiding something from us." "From me?" David's shoulders slumped, and he gestured for her to sit on the small couch across from his desk. Margaret hesitated for a moment before lowering herself onto the cushion. "I didn't want this to come out," David started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you or Elijah. But there's something about Elijah's birth you don't know." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Go on." David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. "The night Elijah was born, there were complications. Things didn't go the way they were supposed to." Margaret's stomach churned. "David, what are you saying?" He hesitated again, his lips parting and closing as if he couldn't quite form the words. "There was another baby. A second baby." But what? David? Say it." David's voice cracked. "The second baby didn't make it. Or at least, that's what they told me." Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she could hear it in her ears. "They told you? What do you mean? Who told you?" "The hospital staff. There were complications." "Margaret, I was so scared. They said it was for the best that we focus on Elijah." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. "And you just accepted that? You didn't ask questions? You didn't?" "I was scared." "Margaret, David said, his voice rising as he finally looked her in the eyes. I was scared of losing you. I was scared of losing Elijah. I didn't question it because I couldn't bear the thought of something worse happening. And then, I tried to forget. I tried to move on. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Margaret shook her head slowly, her tears finally spilling over. David, what if they lied to you? What if Lucas is? David closed his eyes tightly. I've thought about it. Margaret, I've thought about it every day since Elijah started talking about Lucas. But I don't have answers. And I don't know how to get them without turning our entire world upside down. Margaret rose from the couch, her movements slow and deliberate. Our world is already upside down. David. She turned and walked to the door, her back to him. We need answers. I don't care how painful they are, I can't live in the dark anymore. David didn't stop her as she left the study, closing the door quietly behind her. In his room, Elijah lay awake in bed, staring at the faint glow of his nightlight. He could hear muffled voices downstairs, and though he couldn't make out the words, he could tell his parents were fighting. He rolled over and reached for his school photo, tucked carefully under his pillow. He unfolded it and stared at Lucas's face. They were the same. Same hair. Same eyes. Same smile. What if we really are brothers? Elijah thought. His small fingers brushed over the glossy surface of the photo as a knot formed in his stomach. Downstairs, Margaret stood in the darkened hallway, her heart heavy and her mind racing. Whatever secrets were hiding in their past, she was determined to uncover them. The bell rang, and the halls of Pinewood Elementary filled with a stampede of sneakers, laughter, and the sound of lockers slamming shut. Elijah Parker walked with purpose through the crowded corridor, clutching his science textbook tightly to his chest. He scanned the sea of faces until he spotted Lucas Hayes near the drinking fountain. Lucas! Elijah called out, weaving through clusters of kids until he reached his look-alike. Lucas turned around, and for a moment, it felt like Elijah was staring into a mirror. Same brown hair, same hazel eyes, same faint dimple on the left cheek. It still made Elijah's stomach twist in confusion every time he saw him. Hey, Elijah, Lucas said, flashing a grin. Elijah glanced over his shoulder, ensuring no teachers were within earshot. We need to talk. Lucas's smile faded slightly. What's wrong? Elijah pulled Lucas toward a quieter corner of the hallway, away from the chaos. Do you ever feel like there's something our parents aren't telling us? Lucas hesitated, then nodded slowly. Sometimes. My mom gets this weird look on her face when I ask about my real family. She always changes the subject. Why? Elijah's voice dropped to a whisper. What if we're twins? What if we're brothers? Lucas's eyes widened. Do you really think so? I don't know, Elijah admitted, his voice trembling slightly. But we need proof. We need to show everyone how much we look alike. And I have an idea. Lucas leaned in closer. What's your plan? Elijah's lips curved into a determined smile. The class photo. The following morning, the buzz of excitement filled Ms. Turner's fourth-grade classroom. It was picture day, and the students were dressed in their best outfits. Boys wore collared shirts and slicked-back hair, while the girls donned colorful dresses and neatly braided ponytails. Elijah adjusted the collar of his blue button-down shirt as he sat at his desk. Across the room, Lucas was wearing an almost identical shirt in a slightly darker shade of blue. They exchanged a brief glance and a nod, an unspoken confirmation of their plan. Ms. Turner clapped her hands to get the class's attention. All right, everyone, Line up by height. Shortest in the front. Tallest in the back. And remember, smiles. Everyone. The students scrambled into line, chatting excitedly as they adjusted their outfits and fixed their hair. Elijah quickly found Lucas and maneuvered his way next to him in the line. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces nearly identical under the bright lights of the gymnasium. Miss Turner glanced at them, her brows furrowing slightly. Elijah. Lucas, are you two cousins or something? Elijah forced a casual smile. No. Miss Turner. Just friends. The photographer, a stout man with a camera hanging around his neck, gestured for everyone to smile. All right. Kids. Say cheese. Cheese, the class chorused. The flash went off, freezing the moment in time. That evening, Margaret sat in the living room with a mug of tea, her mind heavy with thoughts. David had gone out for a supposed late-night work meeting, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts, and Elijah walked in with his backpack slung over one shoulder. Hey, sweetheart, Margaret said softly. How was school? Elijah hesitated in the doorway before finally speaking. Mom, when do we get our class photos back? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Soon, I think. Why do you ask? Elijah shrugged, trying to appear casual. No reason. I just think this year's photo will be interesting. Margaret's stomach tightened slightly, but she forced a smile. Well, I'm sure it'll be great. Now go wash up before dinner. Elijah disappeared upstairs, leaving Margaret alone with her swirling thoughts. The class photos arrived 2 weeks later. The glossy prints sat in a neat stack on the teacher's desk as Miss Turner handed them out one by one. Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he accepted his envelope. He could feel Lucas's eyes on him from across the room. During recess, the two boys met behind the equipment shed on the far side of the playground. The air smelled faintly of mulch and grass as Elijah carefully pulled out the photo. There they were, standing side by side in the front row, their faces identical, their expressions matching perfectly. Lucas's jaw dropped as he stared at the image. Elijah, we are twins. We have to be. Elijah nodded slowly, his throat tight. We need to show our parents. They can't ignore this. Lucas hesitated. What if they get mad? What if they still don't tell us the truth? Elijah swallowed hard. Then we'll find out the truth ourselves, no matter what. That evening, Margaret sat at the dining table sorting through mail when Elijah approached her, holding the class photo in his small hands. Mom, he said softly, you need to see this. Margaret took the photo and froze. There they were, Elijah and Lucas, standing side by side, identical in every detail. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Elijah, she whispered. Mom, Elijah said, his voice trembling. Are we twins? Is Lucas my brother? Margaret stared at the photo, her mind racing, her heart pounding. The resemblance was undeniable. Every inch of their faces mirrored each other perfectly. Slowly, she set the photo down and pulled Elijah into her arms, holding him tightly. I don't know, sweetheart, she said softly, tears welling in her eyes. But I promise you, I'm going to find out. In her embrace, Elijah felt a flicker of hope. His mother was on his side, and together, they would uncover the truth. Upstairs, in his study, David sat staring at his phone, his face pale and his hands trembling. A message notification glowed on the screen. We need to talk. They're getting too close. David swallowed hard. A cold knot forming in his stomach. Whatever secrets had been buried in their past were beginning to resurface. And there was no stopping them now. Margaret sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The class photo lay on the passenger seat, the glossy image reflecting faint streaks of sunlight filtering through the windshield. Elijah and Lucas stared back at her from the picture, two mirror images, side by side. Their matching smiles unintentional yet haunting. She had spent the entire night pacing in the living room, clutching the photo, and replaying every moment from the past 10 years. Every birthday, every scraped knee, every bedtime story, was it all built on a lie? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. The screen displayed the name, Clara Hayes. Taking a deep breath, Margaret answered. "Hello? Margaret." "It's Clara," came the soft voice on the other end. I think we need to talk. In person. About Lucas. About everything." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, relief and fear swirling in her chest. "Yes. Please. When can we meet?" The coffee shop was quiet, with only a few scattered patrons occupying tables. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung heavy in the air. Margaret spotted Clara sitting in a corner booth, clutching a steaming mug between her hands. Clara looked up as Margaret approached. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as though she hadn't slept in days. "Thank you for meeting me," Clara said softly as Margaret slid into the seat across from her. Margaret placed the class photo between them. "Clara, look at them. Look at their faces. Tell me you don't see it." Clara's gaze dropped to the picture. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her lips quivering. "I see it," she whispered. "I've seen it from the first day Lucas came home. But I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence. A fluke." Margaret leaned in closer. "Clara, I need you to be honest with me. Is Lucas adopted?" Clara hesitated, her eyes welling with fresh tears. "Yes. Lucas is adopted. We brought him home from St. Anne's Adoption Center when he was just a few days old. They told us very little about his biological family, just that he was part of a complicated situation." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Complicated? What does that mean?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know. They didn't tell us much more than that. But there was something strange about the way the staff acted. They seemed nervous, on edge. I didn't question it at the time because I was so overwhelmed with joy to have Lucas in my arms." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her cup of tea, but she couldn't bring it to her lips. "Clara, I think our boys are twins." Clara's head snapped up, her wide eyes locking onto Margaret's. "Twins?" Margaret nodded, her voice cracking. "I think something happened at that hospital. Something we were never told. And I think David knows more than he's letting on." The two women sat in heavy silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. That evening, Margaret returned home to find David sitting in his study, papers scattered across his desk. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment, guilt flashed across his face before he masked it with weariness. "We need to talk," Margaret said, her voice firm. David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Margaret, no more lies." "David," she snapped, slamming the class photo onto his desk. "Look at them. Look at their faces and tell me you don't see it. Tell me you don't see twins." David's face paled, and he rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "Margaret, please." She stepped closer, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. "Did you know?" Did you know about Lucas? About Elijah having a brother? Tell me the truth. David. David exhaled shakily, his shoulders sagging. I suspected. I didn't know for sure, but I suspected. Margaret staggered back as though she had been physically struck. You suspected? And you said nothing? For 10 years. You've kept this from me? David stood, his voice rising in frustration. Do you think this was easy for me? Margaret? Do you think I haven't been carrying this guilt every single day? The night Elijah was born, everything was chaos. They told me one baby didn't make it. They said it was better if we didn't ask questions, that we should focus on the child we had. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. And you just accepted that? David's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I was scared. Margaret. I was terrified of losing you. Terrified of losing Elijah. I buried the doubts because I thought it was the only way to keep us whole. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice resolute. We need answers. Real answers. Not guesses or suspicions. Clara and I are going to the adoption center tomorrow. And if you have even a shred of decency left, David, you'll come with us. David nodded slowly, his voice breaking. I'll be there. That night, Margaret sat on the edge of Elijah's bed, watching him sleep. His face was peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her eyes welling with tears. I promise you, sweetheart, she whispered. I'll find the truth, no matter what it takes. Outside, the wind howled softly against the windows, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The truth was close, just out of reach, but Margaret could feel it looming on the horizon, ready to change everything they had ever known. Margaret sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The class photo lay on the passenger seat, the glossy image reflecting faint streaks of sunlight filtering through the windshield. Elijah and Lucas stared back at her from the picture, two mirror images, side by side, their matching smiles unintentional yet haunting. She had spent the entire night pacing in the living room, clutching the photo, and replaying every moment from the past 10 years. Every birthday, every scraped knee, every bedtime story, was it all built on a lie? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. The screen displayed the name, Clara Hayes. Taking a deep breath, Margaret answered. Hello? Margaret. It's Clara, came the soft voice on the other end. I think we need to talk. In person. About Lucas. About everything. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, relief and fear swirling in her chest. Yes. Please. When can we meet? The coffee shop was quiet, with only a few scattered patrons occupying tables. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung heavy in the air. Margaret spotted Clara sitting in a corner booth, clutching a steaming mug between her hands. Clara looked up as Margaret approached. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as though she hadn't slept in days. Thank you for meeting me, Clara said softly as Margaret slid into the seat across from her. Margaret placed the class photo between them. Clara, look at them. Look at their faces. Tell me you don't see it. Clara's gaze dropped to the picture. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her lips quivering. I see it, she whispered. I've seen it from the first day Lucas came home. But I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence. A fluke. Margaret leaned in closer. Clara, I need you to be honest with me. Is Lucas adopted? Clara hesitated, her eyes welling with fresh tears. Yes. Lucas is adopted. We brought him home from St. Anne's Adoption Center when he was just a few days old. They told us very little about his biological family. Just that he was part of a complicated situation. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Complicated? What does that mean? Clara shook her head. I don't know. They didn't tell us much more than that. But there was something strange about the way the staff acted. They seemed nervous, on edge. I didn't question it at the time because I was so overwhelmed with joy to have Lucas in my arms. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her cup of tea. But she couldn't bring it to her lips. Clara, I think our boys are twins. Clara's head snapped up, her wide eyes locking onto Margaret's. Twins? Margaret nodded, her voice cracking. I think something happened at that hospital. Something we were never told. And I think David knows more than he's letting on. The two women sat in heavy silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. That evening, Margaret returned home to find David sitting in his study, papers scattered across his desk. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment, guilt flashed across his face before he masked it with weariness. We need to talk, Margaret said, her voice firm. David sighed, leaning back in his chair. Margaret, no more lies. David, she snapped, slamming the class photo onto his desk. Look at them. Look at their faces and tell me you don't see it. Tell me you don't see twins. David's face paled, and he rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. Margaret, please. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. Did you know? Did you know about Lucas? About Elijah having a brother? Tell me the truth. David. David exhaled shakily, his shoulders sagging. I suspected. I didn't know for sure, but I suspected. Margaret staggered back as though she had been physically struck. You suspected? And you said nothing? For 10 years. You've kept this from me? David stood, his voice rising in frustration. Do you think this was easy for me? Margaret? Do you think I haven't been carrying this guilt every single day? The night Elijah was born, everything was chaos. They told me one baby didn't make it. They said it was better if we didn't ask questions, that we should focus on the child we had. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. And you just accepted that? David's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I was scared. Margaret. I was terrified of losing you. Terrified of losing Elijah. I buried the doubts because I thought it was the only way to keep us whole. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice resolute. We need answers. Real answers. Not guesses or suspicions. Clara and I are going to the adoption center tomorrow. And if you have even a shred of decency left, David, you'll come with us. David nodded slowly, his voice breaking. I'll be there. That night, Margaret sat on the edge of Elijah's bed, watching him sleep. His face was peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her eyes welling with tears. I promise you, sweetheart, she whispered. I'll find the truth, no matter what it takes. Outside, the wind howled softly against the windows, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The truth was close, just out of reach, but Margaret could feel it looming on the horizon, ready to change everything they had ever known. Margaret stood outside St. Anne's Adoption Center, the wind tugging at her coat and biting at her cheeks. Beside her, Clara Hayes fidgeted with the strap of her purse, her face drawn and pale. The building loomed before them, a red brick structure with stained glass windows that once might have been welcoming, but now felt cold and unyielding. David had promised he would meet them there, but Margaret wasn't surprised when he didn't show up. Part of her wondered if he ever intended to come at all. "Are you ready for this?" Clara asked softly. Margaret tightened her grip on her purse. "No, but we don't have a choice." Together, they stepped through the glass doors and into a sterile reception area. A young woman with tightly pinned blonde hair sat behind the desk, typing something into her computer. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" the receptionist asked without looking up. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "We need to speak with someone about adoption records. It's urgent." The receptionist glanced up then, her smile professional but distant. "I'm sorry, but adoption records are confidential. We can't share them without proper authorization." Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Please, this is about our sons. We know there's something wrong with their adoption records. We just need answers." The receptionist's smile faltered for a moment before she glanced over her shoulder. "You'll need to speak with Mrs. Alden, our director. Please, have a seat, and I'll see if she's available." The two women sat in stiff chairs, the ticking clock on the wall marking every agonizing second. Margaret's knee bounced up and down as her mind raced. What if they refused to talk? What if David was right, and digging into this only made everything worse? A middle-aged woman with sharp features and graying hair emerged from a hallway. "Mrs. Parker? Mrs. Hayes? I'm Patricia Alden, the director. Please, follow me." The director's office was small but neat, with bookshelves lining the walls and a single framed photograph of a child on her desk. Patricia Alden gestured for them to sit while she took her place behind the desk. "How can I assist you today?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Margaret took the class photo out of her bag and laid it on the desk. "These boys, Elijah and Lucas. Look at them. They're not just friends. Mrs. Alden, they're not just lookalikes. They're twins." Patricia's expression didn't change, but Margaret noticed the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Adoption cases are sealed for a reason, Mrs. Parker," Patricia said carefully. "We can't release information without legal authorization." Clara's voice broke as she spoke. "Please, this isn't just curiosity. Our boys deserve to know the truth. We deserve to know the truth." For a moment, Patricia hesitated, her hand hovering over a stack of folders. Then, with a sigh, she leaned back in her chair. There was an unusual situation surrounding Lucas's adoption, but I can't give you details. Not officially. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean by unusual?" Patricia hesitated again before speaking, her voice low. "The hospital contacted us directly. There was an infant, a twin, I believe. But there were complications, and the hospital wanted everything handled quietly. They insisted there was no surviving family. Lucas was placed with us under expedited circumstances." Margaret felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Why?" Margaret demanded. "Why would they do that? Why hide it?" Patricia shook her head. "I don't know. And honestly, I didn't ask questions. Sometimes, it's better not to." Margaret slammed her palm on the desk, her voice trembling with fury. "Better for who? Not for our children. Not for us." Patricia flinched but didn't reply. Margaret stood, pulling Clara up with her. We're not done here. We will find out the truth, whether you help us or not." As they turned to leave, Patricia's voice stopped them. "There's someone else. A doctor. Dr. Harold Graves. He was overseeing the case at the hospital. If anyone knows the full story, it's him." Margaret turned back, her eyes sharp. "Where can we find him?" Patricia hesitated, then scribbled down an address on a sticky note and handed it over. "Be careful, Mrs. Parker. Sometimes the truth isn't what we want it to be." The drive to Dr. Graves' address was quiet, the tension between Margaret and Clara thick as fog. The address led them to a modest house on the outskirts of town, nestled between two towering oak trees. They parked on the gravel driveway and approached the front door. Margaret knocked firmly. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and a frail man with thinning white hair peered out at them. His face was lined with age, but his pale blue eyes were sharp and calculating. "Dr. Graves?" Margaret asked. "Yes," the man replied cautiously. "Who are you?" "I'm Margaret Parker. And this is Clara Hayes. We're here about our sons, Elijah and Lucas." Dr. Graves' face went pale, and he glanced behind them nervously before stepping aside. "Come in. Quickly." The inside of the house smelled faintly of dust and mothballs. They followed Dr. Graves into a small sitting room cluttered with papers and medical journals. "I knew this day would come," he said as he lowered himself into a worn armchair. "I hoped it wouldn't. But here we are." Margaret perched on the edge of a faded couch. "Please, doctor, tell us what happened. We deserve to know." Dr. Graves sighed, his voice heavy with regret. "There were twins. 2 healthy baby boys. But there was a mix-up, a cover-up. The hospital director at the time, he wanted to hide the truth. 1 baby was given to you, Mrs. Parker. The other was funneled into the adoption system under false pretenses." Clara gasped, clutching Margaret's hand tightly. "Why?" Margaret whispered. Dr. Graves shook his head. "I wish I had a clear answer. Money? Reputation? Fear of a lawsuit? I don't know. But when the dust settled, 1 baby went home with you, and the other was sent here, to St. Anne's. And I was told never to speak of it." Margaret's voice trembled. "Does David know? Did he know the truth all along?" Dr. Graves hesitated. He suspected, but he was told the second baby hadn't survived. He wasn't given the full story. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she buried her head in her hands. Clara spoke softly, her voice trembling. "And now? What do we do now?" Dr. Graves looked at them, his eyes filled with sadness. "You tell your sons the truth, and you fight for them, and for each other." The women rose slowly, their faces etched with grief and determination. As they left the house and stepped into the pale afternoon sunlight, Margaret's heart felt both heavy and light. The truth was out now, raw and unfiltered. The road ahead would be filled with pain, but also with hope. Back in the car, Margaret turned to Clara. "Our boys deserve to know everything. No more secrets." Clara nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. No more secrets. With the weight of truth resting on their shoulders, they drove away, the horizon stretching before them like an uncertain promise. The Parker house was unusually quiet, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Margaret stood by the window, staring blankly at the raindrops streaking down the glass. Outside, the sky hung low with dark clouds, mirroring the storm brewing inside her chest. Behind her, David sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn and hollow, as if the weight of the past 10 years had finally settled on his shoulders all at once. "You lied to me," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling despite the calmness in her tone. "For 10 years. You let me believe everything was fine. You let me believe we had one child when we could have had two. Do you understand how broken that makes me feel?" "David?" David's voice was raw when he spoke. "I didn't know. Margaret. I swear. I didn't know. They told me. They told you." Margaret snapped, spinning around to face him, her eyes blazing with fury and anguish. "And you accepted it. You didn't fight for the truth. You didn't demand answers. You didn't even ask why." David's head bowed under the weight of her words. "I was scared. I was so scared of losing you. Margaret. You were unconscious. The doctors were talking in circles. And all I could think about was bringing you home. Bringing someone home. I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Margaret's voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Do you have any idea what we've stolen from them? From Elijah and Lucas? 10 years. David. 10 years of birthdays. Holidays. First days of school, all those moments they could have had together." David's voice trembled as he spoke, each word coated in guilt. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought the pain of losing one child was something neither of us could bear. But I see now. I see how wrong I was." Margaret turned away from him again, clutching her arms tightly around herself as if to hold her breaking heart together. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. The clock continued its relentless ticking, each second echoing like a drumbeat of regret. Finally, David rose to his feet and crossed the room, standing a few feet behind Margaret. "Do you hate me, Margaret?" She didn't turn around. Her voice was small, fragile. "No. I don't hate you, David. But I don't know how to forgive you either." David's breath hitched, and he nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I understand." The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the gray clouds, casting a pale glow over the Parker household. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. David lingered near the doorway, watching her cautiously, as if afraid to step closer. "We have to tell Elijah," Margaret said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. David nodded, his face tight with emotion. "I know. How do you tell a child something like this?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for an answer he couldn't give. "We tell him the truth," David said softly. "No more secrets. No more lies." Elijah sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, flipping through a comic book when Margaret and David entered. He glanced up, his bright hazel eyes, so much like Lucas's, flickering with curiosity. "Hey, buddy," David said, his voice soft as he lowered himself to sit beside his son. Margaret joined them on the floor, her knees trembling slightly as she folded herself down next to them. "There's something really important we need to tell you," Margaret began, her voice quivering. "Something about you and Lucas." Elijah's brows furrowed. "Lucas? Is he okay?" "Yes, sweetheart. He's okay," Margaret said quickly, reaching out to touch his hand. "But there's something you need to know about him." David took a deep breath. "Elijah, Lucas isn't just your friend. He's not just someone who looks like you. He's your brother. Your twin brother." The comic book slipped from Elijah's fingers, landing softly on the carpet. His wide eyes darted between his parents. Confusion and disbelief etched into his young face. My brother," he whispered. "Yes," Margaret said, tears brimming in her eyes. "You two were born together. On the same day. In the same hospital. But something happened. And we didn't know. We didn't know he was still out there." Elijah's small hands balled into fists in his lap. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't I know?" David's voice cracked as he spoke. "Because we didn't know, son. Not for sure. And when we started to realize, we were scared. But that's not an excuse. You deserve to know. Lucas deserved to know." Elijah's lips trembled, and Margaret could see the storm of emotions swirling in his young eyes: hurt, confusion, anger, and something else, hope. "Do I get to see him again?" Elijah asked softly. Margaret nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. You'll see him again. And this time, nothing will keep you apart." Elijah nodded slowly, his face set with quiet determination. "I want to see him soon." Later that evening, Margaret stood by the window in the living room, watching the sun sink below the horizon. David joined her, standing silently by her side. "They'll be okay," David said after a long pause. "Elijah and Lucas. They'll be okay because they have us. And they have each other." Margaret turned to face him, her expression softer now. "But will we be okay, David?" David met her gaze, his eyes filled with remorse and love. "I don't know. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, Margaret. I promise you that." Margaret looked at him for a long moment before stepping closer, resting her head against his chest. David's arms wrapped around her tightly, holding her as if she might slip away. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness wouldn't come overnight, and healing would take time. But in that fragile embrace, there was a flicker of hope, a small, fragile light in the darkness. The next day, Margaret and David brought Elijah to Clara's house. The two boys met in the backyard, their faces lighting up as they saw each other. Without hesitation, Elijah ran toward Lucas, and Lucas ran toward Elijah. They collided in a hug, both boys laughing and talking all at once. Margaret and Clara stood side by side, watching their sons with tears in their eyes. "They're going to be okay," Clara said softly. Margaret nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, they will." David stood a few steps away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face etched with guilt but also with something else, hope. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the two boys as they played together, their laughter ringing out across the yard. In that moment, the fractures in their families didn't seem so deep. The road ahead would still be long and filled with challenges. But love, raw, imperfect, and unyielding, would guide them forward. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains of Margaret's living room, casting soft golden patterns on the floor. The Parker home felt quieter than usual, as though the walls themselves were still processing the weight of the secrets that had been uncovered. Margaret sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through a photo album. Her fingers traced over pictures of Elijah as a baby, his first toothless smile, his first birthday cake smeared across his chubby cheeks, his tiny fingers clutching David's thumb. Each image felt heavier now, burdened by the knowledge of what had been lost. Somewhere out there, Lucas had experienced his first smiles, first birthdays, and first steps without them. Margaret felt an ache deep in her chest. It wasn't just guilt, it was grief for the years stolen from both boys. The faint sound of footsteps broke her reverie. David walked into the room, holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one down in front of her before sitting across from her in the armchair. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. David hesitated, holding his mug tightly. I know there's nothing I can say to fix this, Margaret. But I want to be here. I want to help us move forward." Margaret nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, David. But I want to try. For Elijah. For Lucas. For us." David's face crumpled with relief. And for the first time in weeks, the faintest hint of hope flickered in his tired eyes. The following weekend, Margaret and Clara arranged another meeting between the boys, this time at a local park. The wide green expanse was alive with the laughter of children, the chatter of parents, and the distant hum of passing cars. Elijah and Lucas ran ahead, their matching hazel eyes shining with excitement as they chased each other across the playground. They moved together with an instinctive ease, as if they'd spent their whole lives side by side. Margaret and Clara sat on a nearby bench, their eyes never leaving the boys. "They look so happy together," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret nodded, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "It feels right, seeing them like this. Like something that was broken is finally starting to heal." Clara sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've spent so many nights wondering about Lucas's birth parents, wondering if he was loved before he came to me. And now I know he was. He was loved before he was even born." Margaret reached over and took Clara's hand. "They're going to be okay. And so are we. It's going to take time, but we'll figure it out." Clara gave her a small nod, and the 2 women sat in silence for a while, watching their sons weave in and out of the play structures, their laughter carrying on the breeze. As weeks turned into months, the families slowly began to mend the fractures that had been created by years of silence and secrecy. Playdates became more frequent, and weekend outings turned into shared dinners and movie nights. The bond between Elijah and Lucas grew stronger with every passing day. One Friday evening, Margaret found herself standing in her kitchen, stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce as the sound of laughter echoed from the living room. David was sitting on the couch with Elijah and Lucas, both boys huddled on either side of him as he attempted to help them with a model airplane. "Careful, Lucas, don't glue your fingers together." David laughed. Elijah grinned. "Too late." Margaret leaned against the kitchen doorway, a soft smile playing on her lips as she watched the scene unfold. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was love, and it was worth fighting for. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Lucas sleeping over in the guest room, Margaret and David found themselves sitting on the porch, the night air cool and crisp. "Do you think we're doing enough?" David asked softly, his gaze fixed on the distant glow of streetlights. Margaret took a long breath before answering. "We can never give them back the years they lost, David. But we can give them now, and we can give them tomorrow. That has to be enough." David nodded slowly, reaching over to take her hand. "I'm proud of them, of how strong they are. And I'm proud of you, Margaret. You never stopped fighting for the truth." Margaret's throat tightened, but she squeezed his hand in return. "I had to, David. For them. For us." Not everything was smooth. There were days when the weight of the truth felt unbearable, days when Margaret would see Elijah and Lucas together and feel an overwhelming rush of guilt for the time they had lost. David still carried his shame quietly, doing his best to make up for the mistakes of the past. One evening, As Margaret was tucking Elijah into bed, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mom?" "Yes." "Sweetheart? Do you think Lucas and I would have been best friends if we'd grown up together?" Margaret felt her heart clench, but she forced a smile. "I think you two would have been inseparable." Elijah smiled sleepily. "Well, we'll just have to make up for lost time now." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes as she leaned down to kiss his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. You will." As she turned off the light and closed the door, Margaret felt a sense of fragile peace settle over her. A few weeks later, both families gathered at a quiet picnic area near the lake. A large blanket was spread out under a shady tree, and the boys splashed in the shallow water while their parents unpacked baskets of food. David and Clara stood a few feet away, watching as Margaret set out plates and drinks. "She's stronger than I ever realized," David said quietly. Clara nodded. "We all are." As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the lake, Elijah and Lucas ran back toward their parents, their faces flushed and their laughter contagious. "Come on," Elijah called. "We're going to skip rocks." The adults followed, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt light. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer overshadowed the hope of the future. Margaret stood hand in hand with David, watching their son and his brother play together. And in that moment, she knew that while their journey had been marked by heartbreak and loss, it was also filled with love, resilience, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The scent of roasted chicken and baked bread filled Clara Hay's dining room as sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains. The table was set with care, mismatched plates and glasses giving it a warm, homey feel. A vase of fresh daisies stood proudly in the center, their petals dancing slightly in the breeze from an open window. Margaret adjusted one of the plates, her fingers lingering for a moment as she exhaled slowly. Across the table, Clara poured iced tea into glasses, her movements deliberate and steady. But Margaret could see the slight tremor in her hands. "They're running late," Clara said, her voice light, though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "They'll be here," Margaret replied with a soft smile, though her stomach was twisted in nervous knots. Today was monumental, the first time both families would sit together under one roof, sharing a meal not as two separate units, but as one fragile, interconnected family. The road to this moment had been paved with heartbreak, hard conversations, and tentative steps toward healing. From the living room came the sound of giggles and soft footsteps. Elijah and Lucas had wasted no time picking up where they left off, their laughter echoing through the house. "They sound happy," Clara said, her voice tight with emotion. "They are happy," Margaret replied. "They deserve this." The sound of the doorbell startled both women. Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel as Clara hurried to the door. David stood on the porch, holding a casserole dish wrapped carefully in foil. He looked tired but determined, his shoulders squared and his expression earnest. "Hey," Clara said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Hi, Clara," David said, offering a small smile before stepping into the house. His eyes met Margaret's across the room, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade away. Margaret walked over, her heart hammering in her chest. "You made it," David nodded, setting the casserole down on the kitchen counter. "I wouldn't miss it." The sound of feet pounding down the hallway broke the tense silence as Elijah and Lucas burst into the room. "Dad!" Elijah cried, running straight into David's arms. David hugged him tightly before his eyes shifted to Lucas, who stood slightly behind Elijah, his small hands gripping the hem of his shirt. "Hi, Lucas," David said softly, crouching down to the boy's eye level. "Hi," Lucas said shyly. After a brief hesitation, Lucas stepped forward, and David pulled him into a gentle hug. Margaret's throat tightened as she watched the scene, tears pooling in her eyes. Dinner began with an air of cautious optimism. The adults chatted lightly about school, work, and the boys' antics during their last playdate. The sound of utensils clinking against plates filled the pauses in conversation, but the warmth in the room was undeniable. Elijah and Lucas sat side by side, occasionally whispering to each other and bursting into laughter over some private joke. "So, what do you boys want to do this summer?" David asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Elijah spoke first, his eyes bright with excitement. "We want to go camping. In a real tent." Lucas nodded eagerly. "With a campfire and marshmallows." Clara smiled, her eyes softening as she watched the boys' animated expressions. "I think we can make that happen." Margaret's heart swelled at the sight. Despite everything, despite the scars they all carried, there was something undeniably beautiful about this moment. As dinner wrapped up, Clara brought out a chocolate cake, the flicker of candles casting a warm glow over the faces gathered around the table. "To family," Margaret said softly as she raised her glass. "To family," the others echoed. The words hung in the air, binding them together like an invisible thread. After dinner, the adults moved to the living room while Elijah and Lucas disappeared upstairs with a box of Lego bricks. The soft murmur of their voices drifted down the stairs, mixed with bursts of laughter. David sat in an armchair, his hands folded tightly in his lap, while Margaret and Clara shared the couch. "Thank you," David said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. "For letting me be here. For letting me try to be part of this." Clara nodded, her expression kind. "It's not easy, David. But we're all trying. And that's what matters." Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at David. "We're not perfect, any of us. But we're here. And we're trying. That's more than enough for now." David swallowed hard, nodding as he looked down at his hands. The weight of his guilt was still visible on his face. But for the first time, Margaret saw something else: hope. Upstairs, Elijah and Lucas sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor, Lego pieces scattered around them. "Do you think we'll always be friends?" Lucas asked quietly, his hazel eyes wide with sincerity. Elijah looked up from the half-built spaceship in his hands. "Not just friends. Brothers. We'll always be brothers." Lucas grinned, a wide, toothy smile that mirrored Elijah's perfectly. "Brothers forever," Lucas said. The two boys bumped fists before diving back into their pile of bricks, their laughter ringing out once again. As the evening came to an end, Margaret and David stood on the porch while Clara said goodbye to the boys inside. The stars had begun to sprinkle across the night sky, and the air was cool and still. "Tonight felt good," David said hesitantly. Margaret nodded, her arms crossed against the chill. "It did." David hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think we can keep this going? The four of us? The two families?" Margaret turned to face him, her expression soft but serious. "It's not going to be easy, David. But I think we can. As long as we keep showing up. As long as we keep trying." David smiled faintly. "Then I'll keep trying." Margaret let out a long breath, the weight on her chest feeling just a little lighter. Inside the house, Elijah and Lucas peeked through the curtains, watching their parents on the porch. "They're going to be okay," Elijah said confidently. Lucas nodded in agreement. Yeah, they are. For the first time in a long while. The night didn't feel heavy with unspoken truths or buried secrets. It felt peaceful. And as the Parker and Hayes families went their separate ways that night, they carried with them something they hadn't felt in years: hope.
When secrets surface, families are tested, but in the end, love prevails. What part of this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts and this story with others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.